Welcome to the News9 Plus show on the world's first news and current affairs OTT platform, News9 Plus. I want to begin by introducing our guest for this evening, Lieutenant General Philip Campose, former Vice Chief of Army Staff and a keen observer of military affairs and geopolitics. General Campose, welcome to the News9 Plus show.
Thank you, Sandeep.
General Campose, break it down for us what we are seeing in Gaza right now. The relentless bombing campaign. Israeli forces have surrounded the Gaza Strip and there's talk of a ground invasion beginning anytime now. What exactly is playing out on the ground?
See, ever since the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October, the Israel government and the military had to respond, because not only in Israel but all over the world this was seen as unprecedented, a huge failure of the Israeli defense forces and their security system. So to that extent, they have to take action to get over their setback. So as far as at one level, we are talking of retribution for the 1,400 people who were killed, the thousands who were injured on that day, the 200 plus who have been abducted, and simultaneously you want to wipe out the Hamas,
Right.
the Hamas fighters, the Hamas leadership. So that appears to be the Israeli plan at the moment, and to that extent that is what we have been seeing ever since 7th of October when this attack took place, that somehow they are trying, the Israeli defense forces are trying to meet these two objectives.
Right. In fact, General Campose, I was reading your book, The National Security Strategy for India, and the reason I want to refer to it is very interesting what you said about the global strategic context. You spoke of the big flashpoints in the world. You spoke of NATO's eastward expansion in Europe, counter moves by Russia and Ukraine and Georgia, and a new power struggle on the global stage appears to be underway with the US, Europe, Japan and allies on one side, and China and its allies, China, Russia and its allies on the other side. And the flashpoints you said in the near future are East Asia because of China's hostility towards Taiwan, South Korea and Japan. The Middle East is another area that you spoke of very clearly, and you spoke of Israel and the violence in Syria, Libya, Yemen and Iraq. This book was written in 2018. Did you have an idea of what was going to unfold 5 years from now?
Well, this book was written in 2017. It was published in 2018.
6 years ago.
Yeah, 6 years ago. That was my assessment at that point as to how things were going to pan out in the world.
Right.
And unfortunately, much of it is proved to be true.
Right. So two of those flashpoints that you mentioned are ablaze right now as we speak. There's Russia in Ukraine and the Middle East. And of course, Taiwan is not too far behind. It looks like it's also simmering. But how long did this entire thing, what we are seeing around us right now, the seeds of this were sown several decades ago. Could you take us down this, when you wrote this in 2017, did you have a fair idea that things would kind of explode, go out of control in just 5 years?
See, as far as these flashpoints that you're talking about, the eastward expansion of the NATO was something which Russia was very sensitive to, especially when it came to Ukraine and Georgia. And it had been spoken about as much by the Russian leadership.
Right.
So to that extent, there was a sense that if things did not change for the better, then at some stage or the other we would see hostilities break out in these countries, starting with Ukraine. And that unfortunately has what has happened. The Middle East is another story.
Right.
The Middle East, right from 1948, it has been simmering.
Right.
Anybody who's been to the Middle East, and I have been there, I was with the United Nations in Iraq in 2000, 2001, between the two Iraq wars.
Right.
And I had an opportunity to go to Jordan on a number of occasions because there was the sanctions against Iraq, and we couldn't land directly in Baghdad.
Right.
So to that extent, we used to land in Amman and get our visas stamped. It used to take us a day or two, and then we used to come. And I must have done this 7 or 8 times during my tenure in Iraq. And while you were in Jordan, you got a sense of the Palestinian issue,
Right.
because you bumped into the Palestinians all the time. And while I was there, the second Intifada, I think it was,
Right.
the second one broke out.
Yep.
So one had a sense of this issue simmering,
Right.
and you felt that if it is not resolved
Yeah.
in the best possible manner,
Right.
this was bound to keep exploding every
Right.
once in a while.
Since you have a crystal ball, sir, and you've correctly predicted what the world was going to be like, flashpoints, can you look at the situation, the scenario right now, where this talk of a Cold War 2.0, incidentally, you've used that word in your book as well, Cold War 2.0. Do you see the prospects of this conflict spreading, the one in the Middle East, or will it remain confined to Israel and Gaza? Because a lot of other powers have gotten into the game.
Prospects of it spreading are there.
Right.
I won't say that they are not there, that everything is fine and all the players concerned are going to play their part in a very responsible manner.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen. But
You don't think the conflict is going to spread?
I think it has the potential for spreading.
Right.
But on the other hand, the United States is also engaged in the process.
Right.
And to that extent, my sense is it's the United States which will ensure that this does not spread,
Right.
that this will not escalate. Because
which is why they've got their carrier strike groups there, and
whichever
keep
way
the
they're
other.
doing, whether
Right.
they do it by deterrence, whether they
Right.
do it by one-to-one
Yeah.
conversations with various leaders. But on the ground,
Yeah.
my sense is that they will not allow it to escalate.
Right.
So whatever you are seeing
Yeah.
being spoken out by the leadership publicly,
Right.
I'm sure there is much more going on privately.
Right.
And
right.
there would be
behind the scenes.
my sense is that
diplomacy, yeah.
things will not be allowed to escalate.
It won't be allowed.
And to that extent, I think after
Yeah.
some time there will be some sort of cooling down,
Right,
as
right.
I see it.
But even as we're speaking, Israeli forces have surrounded Gaza, and there's talk of a ground-based invasion that could take place in the next couple of days. Could you take us through what the Israeli forces would be facing if they enter Gaza?
See, it's going to be a very, very tough call.
Right.
And why I say that is anybody who has seen pictures of aerial pictures of Gaza,
Right.
you know that it's a very, very crowded place.
Right.
Lots of concrete buildings, lots of houses, lots of people. 2.3 million is the numbers people
Yeah,
talk about.
yeah.
And then when you talk in terms of orders given by the Israeli government that those who are in northern Gaza should shift to southern Gaza,
Right.
the density of population
Yeah.
in an area where there are very narrow streets and roads,
Right.
the
right.
density is going to increase.
Right.
And so much of any sort of battles that are fought,
Yeah.
much of these are going to be fought, many of these are going to be fought in an urban terrain, in towns, in cities.
Right.
And to that extent, it's a very complex, the entire ambit of urban warfare, it's very, very complex. And to that extent, I do see the Israelis facing a very tough time, but I'm
Right.
sure they are preparing for it, and that is why they have not, initially there was talk about an immediate launch of
Yes,
operations,
yes.
but that hasn't taken place.
Right.
Obviously, because they are preparing. They
Yeah.
are also well aware
Right.
of the complexity of such a war, and to that extent, I'm sure they are preparing and training
Right.
to take on. To talk about complexity, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war,
Of course.
there is a city called Bakhmut,
Right.
where the war went on for, the battles went on for almost 9 months
Right.
before Bakhmut was captured by the Russian army this year in May.
Absolutely, and
Okay.
urban combat is absolutely
And-
brutal.
And if you see how that thing panned out
Yeah.
and what eventually led to success when
Right.
the Wagner group
Yeah.
came to control and won it on behalf of the Russian army,
Right.
you get the complexity when you deal with urban environment,
Right.
urban war environment,
Yeah.
where you have snipers, you have booby
Absolutely,
traps,
yeah.
you have IEDs, you have people hiding behind rubble, hiding in these buildings.
Right.
And you have you're engaged with handheld weapons.
In fact, I just put together this explainer, sir, on the rules of urban combat, the general rules, based on the kind of combat that we've seen this century. Let's take a look. The Israeli military is poised to enter Gaza soon to fight Hamas and rescue over 200 hostages. Now they'll have to engage in urban warfare. Urban warfare, or fighting in built-up areas as it's called, is among the most challenging forms of warfare. Now, the siege of Stalingrad during the Second World War was the worst urban war in history. It lasted 5 months and caused the deaths of over 2 million people. Now, the 21st century has seen intense and brutal combat in cities from Fallujah and Mosul in Iraq, Marawi in the Philippines, and more recently, Bakhmut and Mariupol in Ukraine. Fighting in cities is complex, it's slow, it's destructive, and horribly costly in human life, especially civilian lives. Fighting is slow and grinding, it's house by house and street by street, and there are several reasons why this is challenging. Here are the 5 immutable rules of urban combat. Cities level the battle space between attackers and defenders. In fact, they favor defenders over the attackers because smaller groups of defenders can hold their ground against larger enemy forces. Conventional warfare involves an attacking force overwhelming its opponents using firepower and massed bodies of troops. In a city, defenders can hide in buildings, they can create networks of tunnels under the buildings that will allow them to switch positions and fire on the attacking force. In Gaza, for instance, Hamas is believed to have created a fortified network of nearly 500 kilometers of underground tunnels, unlike any seen in the world. A city attack is complicated. It's a combined arms assault against urban centers. It involves infantry, artillery, special forces, tanks, intelligence, surveillance, combat engineers, and drones. But the disadvantage is that the attackers are in the open, and hence they take fire from the enemy hidden inside the cities. Now, enemies can target the opposing forces using rocket-propelled grenades, they can fire at them using snipers and booby traps. Buildings become bunkers in urban warfare. Buildings are built of concrete and bricks. They can resist gunfire. So that's a very important plus point seen from the perspective of a defender. Every doorway and every window becomes an opening through which snipers or anti-tank crews can fire at the enemy. Now, because buildings are so useful to defenders, they will have to be destroyed. And this is usually done by aerial bombardment or firing heavy caliber weapons or planting explosives or using tanks. There are additional challenges because the rubble itself is used by both sides to hide and fire at each other. One of the principles of military offensives is the concentration of forces to overwhelm the enemy. The problem in city warfare is that the terrain is such that it forces both the attackers and the defenders to break themselves up into smaller teams and to assault buildings and streets with smaller teams led by young officers and NCOs. So, warfare itself is broken down into a series of smaller actions as opposed to larger engagements that conventional wars normally see. So these are some of the rules the Israeli forces will have to keep in mind as they enter the Gaza Strip. But in fact, what the IDF faces is far more complicated and complex than what we have seen in all these sieges in Mariupol.
What is
hostages.
much more complicated in this particular case,
right,
like Mariupol to some extent, is the underground factor.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Because normally when you talk of fighting in towns and cities, you are talking in fighting over ground.
Right.
The problem is the houses, the buildings, people hiding behind these, people hiding behind the rubble, snipers. But to all that, if you add the factor of going underground, and there
human shields,
I've read reports that there are 500 kilometers of tunnels.
Right.
Now, if that is true, it might be exaggerated, but even if it is partially true, you can well imagine what the Israeli army will face.
Right. Is that one of the reasons that they did a second take and they didn't go in immediately, as you said?
I'm sure.
What kind of preparations?
Israeli
they're extremely
army
professional.
is a professional army, and to that extent, I suppose they know the complexities. And after all, they are going in after having suffered a huge setback.
Right.
So they cannot be complacent. They cannot say that Hamas is some ragtag army, which or ragtag group of fighters whom they can sort out without any problem.
Right.
They're well aware after what's happened on 7th of October that they are dealing with somebody who can be equally well trained and motivated.
Right.
So to that extent, I'm sure they are going about this in a very, very deliberate manner, examining what exactly they're going to face, and to that extent, they would be training and preparing for this.
What kind of preparations do you think they would do? Because, I mean, one is very well versed, as you mentioned, with the Israeli Defense Forces. They're very meticulous, they work to a plan, they're very professional army, and one has the example of the rescue at Entebbe, where they literally in a matter of hours, they put together a rescue operation. Do you think that as of now, they would be working out a contingency, rehearsing for storming tunnels, for instance? What kind of preparations could there be?
They would be doing these things. What you have to remember is that the Israeli army, the bulk of the army are reservists.
Yes.
And many of these reservists come out of the conscripts.
Right.
So when an Israeli young man or young lady, they finish school or college or whatever, at a certain stage, they go and do their conscript service, compulsory service. After which they go into the reserve. Okay. So now there is some, because of what has happened on October 7th, reports say that 360,000 Israeli reservists have been. Now, when you get reservists whom you sort of get back into service, you have to train them, because everybody is not a professional soldier.
Right.
So there are professionals, there are professional soldiers who are very, very professional, and I'm sure we've all heard about the professionalism of the Israeli Defense Forces. But the bulk, there is a very, very large component who are reservists and who are conscript soldiers who have not really
fired a shot
faced a proper war situation.
Right.
And like I told you, this is going to be tough, and you're facing somebody who's also well trained and motivated. So to that extent, there will be a lot of training going on at the moment, and like you said, it will be all sorts of you'll be recreating the sort of situation that they are likely to face. You'll be creating those sort of situations, and then you will be playing that through war games for the senior commanders and for at the tactical level, at the battalion commander level, brigade commander level. They must be all, they'll get into this physically, and that's what they must be doing.
So I want to ask you about the Indian Army and urban combat. You know, like, I mean, urban combat is something that Indian Army has not really done in the last 75 years. I mean, 65 we reached the outskirts of Lahore, but we didn't enter. In 71, in the east, in East Pakistan, we bypassed all the towns and villages and cities, and we headed straight for Dhaka. 87, of course, was an exception where we took a lot of casualties, over 200 officers and in taking Jaffna. 2 weeks, I believe, is what it lasted. Is the Indian Army aware of the complexities of urban warfare? And if so, are they training for it?
Of course, the Indian Army is well aware, because as we are all aware that no longer are the areas where we are likely to operate.
Right.
No longer are they open terrain.
Right. Right.
And much of these areas across the border, the habitations have come up. Whatever
That's right,
small
yeah.
hamlets have become big villages. Whatever villages have become townships. Whatever townships have become cities.
Cities on the this is on the western border where there is
So I'm talking about the western border. So
densely populated.
So accordingly, as per our war
Yes.
plans, as per our training,
Right.
we have factored this, and I'm
Right.
sure this is a dynamic process which the Indian Army is not only aware of.
Right.
They must be preparing for it as part of their own war planning and equipping.
And you know, while we're talking about planning and equipping and this war that's on, literally one phase of this war that's on in full swing in Israel, our attention is diverted towards the United Nations, the body that was set up to prevent conflict has once again proved itself to be powerless. And in fact, the UN is nowhere on the scene as all the major regional powers are engaged in various peace processes, trying to ask Israel to halt their offensives. And in fact, Israel's ambassadors just called on the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to resign for what he termed as insensitivity. We've got this documentary on how the United Nations has failed in West Asia once again. Let's take a look.
Ever since the terror attack in Israel, which killed more than 1,400 innocents in southern Israel on 7th of October, we've seen the United Nations condemn the Hamas terror attack. At the same time, United Nations, after the airstrikes in Gaza from Israel, has urged for humanitarian aid not to be stopped. But unfortunately, there hasn't been any consensus on that. Israel has said that it will not allow from its territory any kind of food, water, medical supplies or humanitarian aid to be given to Gaza.
The United Nations has played mainly one role, and that role has been through its humanitarian assistance agencies like UNRWA, which provides humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank through food supplies, medicine, health, hospital, education, etc. Now, year after year, resolutions have been approved in the United Nations in the General Assembly on the Autonomous State of Palestine, Resolution 268, 322, etc. There has been a huge number of resolutions, and in fact, the UNGA at one time had passed a resolution describing Zionism as racism, and then later on in 1992, it annulled the resolution after the Oslo Accord, and when there was some sign of peace on the horizon, and we thought that it's going to end up, it didn't happen. Therefore, I would say that United Nations has been ineffective, quite ineffective in finding a solution to the Palestinian issue.
I think when United Nations was formed, its basic objective was to rise above the rest and in fact bring in peaceful resolution, think about humanity at a time when you had world wars, etc., and a lot of suffering all across the globe.
Whether it is prevention, whether it is conflict resolution, whether it is peacekeeping and peace building, the UN is handicapped severely by the fact that the UN Security Council is being run by a group of 5 countries who were victors of the Second World War.
The San Francisco Conference and all. At that time, this was decided that the problem that the previous League of Nations faced could not recur again. And that is why the 5 countries which were the victors of the war assumed this power to maintain the global order. Now, eventually, they became used to this power, exercising it through the veto for their own geopolitical interests.
But in the last many decades, we've seen that the United Nations has become a toothless tiger. It's a body merely on paper. It does not have any strengths, power, and it's completely powerless when it comes to resolving conflicts or actually taking a consensus and a stand on global conflicts or issues that concern the humanity. We've seen over the last 20 months during the Russia-Ukraine war, there hasn't been a consensus. On Israel-Palestine as well, again at the UNSC, no resolution or any move could be passed. And perhaps the world saw a ray of hope in the United Nations, but I think UN has failed completely to bring in any kind of peace in most of the recent conflicts.
So in the United Nations, things don't move if the P5 countries are not on board. And we have seen for these two resolutions, one was by Russia, the other was by Brazil. Both of them were voted down by the Americans, reasons known to them.
Today the world is riven as almost going back to the Cold War days. We are talking about a Cold War 2.0, and you see it in the UN Security Council. The paralysis there. You have P3 versus P2. And unfortunately, the unreformed UN Security Council does not have balancing third pole like India.
United Nations has become redundant. It is becoming increasingly irrelevant. It is simply turning into a talk shop. And for that, the credit goes to those 5 countries as I mentioned, not to the other. The 193 other countries are perfectly fine. They want the UN to work. They want multilateral system to be stronger. I think that the most important, in my view, would be that either empower the UNGA, for which the charter needs to be also changed, or they should have a majority decision. In the United Nations Security Council, which exists for 9 members and all that. But at the same time, it also says that there is no veto. So if that can go away, you can say 3/4 countries, member countries support at a given time, then it will go through.
We saw in 1945 when the United Nations was founded. And we need the Security Council to reflect the current geopolitical realities of the world.
I want to bring in Aditya Kaul, our executive editor who covers national security and diplomacy. Aditya, the United Nations is back in the news after 2 weeks of complete silence. Take us through what's been going on at the UN today.
Well, Sandeep, we've been witnessing this for a very long time. It's nothing new, and it was bound to happen. The UN has almost collapsed.
Right.
UN is a toothless tiger, and we've time and again seen, just like in our story Unmasked, we had spoken about how the reforms in UNSC are much required. The 5 countries, the permanent members, the P5, are doing whatever they want as per their own whims and fancies for their own self-interest, and not considering the larger world. For instance, the global south, their needs, their demands have been ignored time and again. And this time around, there's been a confrontation with none other than the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, where the envoy, the permanent representative of Israel, has not only termed it shocking, but now Israel has demanded the resignation of Antonio Guterres, because he said that the terror attacks on 7th October did not happen in vacuum, actually putting the blame on Israel. So what has now happened is a diplomatic escalation. The foreign minister of Israel, Eli Cohen, has now boycotted a meeting with the UN Secretary General, and Benny Gantz has called, in fact, Antonio Guterres a terror apologist. So I don't know how this diplomacy is going to de-escalate as of now, but it doesn't seem like this is going to end anytime soon. We also saw Pakistan raise up the issue of Kashmir and blame India without naming India. And of course, India has responded to that as well.
So, General Campose, we were talking earlier about how the United Nations seems to have lost a lot of its relevance, especially when there's a war. The first people to go missing in action is the United Nations. And seems to be the case once again here in West Asia.
Yeah, just as Aditya said just now, the United Nations is as good as its leadership, the way it has been set up. And when we talk about the leadership, it finally boils down to the permanent members of the Security Council.
The P5, yes.
And this is an issue that the government of India has been taking up again and again, in terms of stating that the membership of the Security Council, or at least the permanent membership, is reflective of what was the reality at the end of the Second World War. And what is happening today, 77, 78 years later, is that things are totally different. India is not what it was 78 years back.
Right.
So to that extent, there is a sense that the leadership of the United Nations should be reflective of the influence of countries as it stands today, whether
Right.
it's economic or political. And we all know that India is a power in being and a power of the future.
Right.
And to that extent, time and again, this issue has been raised. Time and again, hopes have been raised that seriously they are looking at this issue, and it's only a matter of time before India is included in the leadership of the UN. But it hasn't happened, and because it has happened, we continue to see what's like you described, that they are always missing in action.
Aditya, you think it's going to change if India gets on to the UN Security Council, the permanent membership, P5?
Sandeep, there's a big if, and if you ask me, I don't think it will happen.
Right.
The technicalities of UN are such,
right,
and there's a fierce war of words that goes on,
Yeah.
so there won't be a consensus. Even if the majority of the countries are of the opinion that India rightly deserves, and there are majority countries.
I think 4 out of the 5 countries are open to
in
India.
the P5, and overall,
Right.
if we speak of the UNGA as well,
Yeah.
I think most of the countries would back India, rightly so,
Right.
and have stated that in several bilateral and multilateral conversations, but it's unlikely to happen. What we also see is that on several issues, UN has completely collapsed. We saw during the pandemic as well, there were a lot of questions raised at the WHO
Right,
as well as the UN. We saw on the issue of India-Pakistan,
Right.
apart from establishing an UNMOGIP, which is almost useless, monitoring body both in India and Pakistan, doesn't serve any purpose, after more than 70 years.
Right.
So the UN does not know how to reform itself, how to change with the times, and go, in a new direction, really. So what has really happened in the context of Israel and Palestine as well, UN is continuously speaking about humanitarian aid, but particularly about terrorism, it has shown no consensus, no willingness to in fact tackle terrorism. In fact, India, for instance, brought in the convention to combat terrorism in the year 1996.
Right.
It's been more than 25 years now, and there's been no action at all,
There's
no
no,
consensus, even on
absolutely.
defining terrorism.
Even on defining terrorism, and that's how complicated things are. But if the UN is so toothless, Aditya, why do we want to be part of it?
Well, there's no other option or other body as of now. That's the last resort that each and every country goes to. It's like a punching bag, that everybody goes to, goes off the steam, all the anger goes off there. But it remains somewhere back of your mind, back of your, diplomacy. And speak about Middle East, speak about China, speak about Ukraine, Russia. I don't think in the last at least 30 to 40 years there hasn't been any significant conflict that UN has been able to resolve.
No conflict. General Campose, is there any conflict at all in the last 70, 80 years that the UN has resolved?
There have been a few, but very few and far between.
Few and far.
But generally, it doesn't sort of get the consensus to go through with the entire thing. At one time, we blamed the Cold War, and to that extent, you could never get a consensus in the Security Council to deal with issues, to even send peacekeepers to these countries where conflicts were taking place. But then, when the Cold War ended in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a sense that things would change. But then on the ground, things really didn't change. And now when we talk of Cold War 2.0, then we are again sort of foreseeing a certain period where things are going to continue as they have been right from the beginning.
Right, and where do you see India's role in the West Asia? So we've been strangely quiet. Aditya, correct me if I'm wrong, apart from sending relief supplies and pulling our nationals out, we've not really said too much about the situation.
Well, Sandeep, India's traditionally and historically policy towards West Asia, and in particular if we speak about Israel-Palestine, has been very balanced. It was tilted towards Palestine since last many decades.
Of course,
but gradually it changed. We were one of the first non-Arab nations to recognize the state of Palestine. Gradually in the last 30 years, we have built up diplomatic ties with Israel. We have had a very robust trade as well as technology and most important defense partnership with
Right.
Israel. A lot of it, as we have been often speaking about, the intelligence and the robotics and the
Yes,
drones
yes.
are not talked about so much.
Right.
But there's a great level of cooperation. In fact, again, one thing that we have spoken about is the Balakot
Yeah,
attacks and
yeah.
the spice bombs that came in from
Yes.
Israel. Really, so it's a much appreciated relationship. In fact, today the Israeli government, the IDF, is holding an international press conference in which it will be providing proof of the
Right.
Hamas terrorism, and it will be live all across in several cities. And one of the cities chosen is New Delhi, where
Right.
the Israeli ambassador at his residence himself
Yeah.
is hosting senior editors on it. So I think
Right.
India and Israel have a very close relationship, but India will not compromise its
Yeah,
position on Palestine. It has sent in aid, but at the same time condemns terrorism and maintains that dialogue is the only way forward.
Right. So I want to bring your attention to this report that I've been reading from the US, where the United States, has, it seems, moved in special operators to assist the IDF in the upcoming operations in the Gaza Strip, where their former US Marine Forces Special Operations Command officers, and in fact last week the Department of Defense, the US DoD spokesperson Sabrina Singh said the US was providing intelligence support to the Israeli-led hostage rescue efforts. Is this because of a lack of capabilities on the Israeli side, or is it something to buy more time for the peace process, you think?
See, Israel and the United States have a very, very close bond right from the beginning, since the formation of Israel, for a very for many reasons.
Right.
Most important being that there was the Jewish people in the United States
Yeah.
itself, and in Europe, and the circumstances in which Israel was formed right from the beginning. This relationship has been very close, and over the years, the Israel is seen as United States permanent ally in the
Middle East. Yes.
So to that extent, there is no question of the United States doing anything that will
Right.
undermine the position and the power of Israel as it stands. So to that extent, there must be a lot of cooperation on security issues
Right.
between Israel and United States. That's not to say that Israel is purely dealing with the United States. As far as we know, the Israel is also dealing with Russia,
Right.
with China, with many other countries, in furtherance of its own national
Right,
interests.
right.
But definitely, United States is standing behind
Yeah.
Israel, as it has always done in the past.
Right.
That's not to say that they do these things blindly. They
Right.
do it very, very deliberately.
Right.
And it's a very mature relationship that exists between these two countries.
Of course. Aditya, is it a do or die situation now for the United States in West Asia, given the inroads that China has been making in the region in the last couple of years?
Absolutely, it's been like that for a while now. With the Israel-Hamas conflict, I think it has
Right.
increased manyfold. And second thing, your first question to the general, really, I feel that the US is buying more time.
Right.
I think because of their blocking of Brazil's resolution at the
At the
United
UNS,
Nations,
yes.
they've taken upon themselves by saying that diplomacy is the way forward.
Right.
And they will be ensuring that this diplomacy with the Arab countries
Yeah.
ensures that there are humanitarian pauses.
Right.
There are 6 to 7 batches of trucks
Yes.
that have gone into Egypt, including aid from India.
Right.
So that means that aid will be pushed in. There will be more time given to civilians to move out. But we
Right.
know for sure that at least a great size of civilians will not be allowed to
Right.
leave by the Hamas, and they'll be used as human shields.
Right.
So it's a devil's playground out there in Gaza. And with, of course, the ground invasion, the ground assault that will
Right.
take place,
Right.
things will move fast, but for a longer duration.
Right.
And we will also have a situation where the de-escalation at that point in time will be very difficult. So
Right.
they are trying all means of diplomacy at this stage. Of course,
Yep.
Israel is not going to listen at all to anyone,
Yeah.
but they are buying as much time as possible.
They're
right?
buying is interesting. So devil's playground. That's a very good turn of phrase, if I may say. how complicated, when was the last time the Middle East saw this kind of a volatile situation? Is it 1991 or Gulf War II, Gulf War I or Gulf War II, or 9/11 probably?
No, the Middle East has been periodically seeing this. If you
Right.
go historically, if you take the Middle East as a larger regional and geographical construct,
Yeah.
you will find that there is always something that's happening. Even when you
Yeah.
say that the Middle East is quiet,
Right.
it means that there are some conflicts that are taking place.
Right,
So
right.
we can't say that what's happened in Israel on the 7th of October
Yeah.
has happened suddenly. After all, the battle in Yemen,
Right.
the problem with the Houthis,
Yes.
that has been on for a very long time. That hasn't stopped.
Absolutely.
Even in Syria,
Right.
every once in a while
There are these
flares
little
up.
flashpoints all
But-
over.
But
yeah.
there are troops,
Yeah.
there is deployment from many countries which
Right.
are still there, which
Right.
still persist, despite the fact that the larger Syrian conflict has sort of toned down.
Right.
But there are these smaller conflicts which continue, and to that extent, I don't think they've really enjoyed peace
Right.
as such. If you go by what happened in the Iraq war, there was a very long period.
Yes.
And then there was the Syrian conflict which followed. Fortunately, yes, in relative terms, you can say that the Middle East was quiet,
Right.
and now it suddenly flared up again.
Right.
Now, how this plays out in the immediate future, how long this is going to continue, and as Aditya said, it's not going to. Israel is not going to be so easy to convince
Yes.
Israel to sort of tone down its military operations. So to that extent, it might continue for quite some time, at least this edition of what is happening in the Middle East.
Right, right. Thank you very much, General Campose. We're going to come back to you and to your crystal ball at some point, but I'm afraid we are totally out of time. Thank you for joining me, General Campose, and Aditya. Do join us on News9 Plus. Download the app. We've been tracking the war in Israel very closely. Download the app and track the latest developments in the war. Thank you for watching.